Hello and welcome everyone to another video in my series on the music of composer Joe Hisaishi, best known for writing the music to many Studio Ghibli films. Today I'd like to spend some time analyzing the main musical theme from the 1986 film Castle in the Sky. I'll play the track first, then we'll dive right into the theme's form. This video will probably go into more music theory than I normally do on my channel, but I thought this track provided a very good opportunity to do that. So what you just heard occurs during the opening credits of Castle in the Sky. It's about 4 minutes into the film. I transcribed this recording by ear, so there are probably a few errors or things that I missed, but I think I got most of it. And interestingly enough, I listened to several recordings of this, plus one of Hisaishi playing a piano arrangement of this, and there are some discrepancies in those recordings, but not to worry. I don't want to get hung up on the small details. So what's actually happening in this cue? Breaking down a piece of music like this will allow you to better understand the composer's use of form, as well as harmony orchestration, and how the composer shapes a 2.5-minute piece of music. So hopefully you'll come away with ideas about composing your own music, maybe in a similar style or something completely different. All right, let's dive in. There are 2 brief introductory sections before the theme kicks in. Having 2 introductions is a little strange, but keep in mind this piece is an introduction to the entire film and film score, so it makes sense that Hisaishi would take a bit more time to get things started. And I view this first introduction as more of a Hisaishi or Studio Ghibli signature sound, so we hear this and we immediately are transported to the Studio Ghibli world. Later in this video series, I'll be looking at musical devices like this that Hisaishi uses throughout his film scores. The solo piano playing rolled chords of chordal harmonies is the quintessential Hisaishi sound, in my opinion. And like in this instance, he often sequences a short motivic idea by transposing it down several times, leading to some type of cadence. The first transposition down is an exact transposition, or at least as far as I could tell. Then measure 3 descends in a similar way, but now we're moving cadentially to the last chord. He brings in this low B-flat note, which forms what sounds like a predominant chord. We'd almost expect this to be some kind of B-flat minor chord, which would lead to some kind of C chord, forming a half cadence that would lead into F minor. That would be the simple, obvious compositional choice, and here's what that would sound like. But Hisaishi doesn't make that choice. He makes the more interesting one by using what I'll label a Hisaishi cadence. He uses a suspended chord to create harmonic ambiguity. Instead of moving up to the C in the bass, he moves down a third and forms a G7 sus4 chord. By suspending the fourth scale degree, the C, and withholding the third, which would be a B natural, he creates smoother voice leading between these two chords. If this last chord were just a regular G7 chord with a B natural, the progression from the previous chord would sound way more chromatic. Instead, we feel like we're existing within this chordal harmony system, hence the suspended fourth scale degree. I've seen him use this type of cadence over and over again throughout his scores. He uses the suspended chord cadentially so often, and it usually coincides with a shift in tonality like a modulation or something to subvert our expectations. After a brief pause in the music, we have a contrapuntal woodwind quartet texture in C minor. So that previous G sus chord set us up perfectly for this new key. Like the first introduction, this one's 4 measures, however we're now at about double the tempo. If you watch my last video on contrapuntal writing, you might notice that this texture is very similar to a woodwind trio from Hisaishi's Nausicaa symphonic poem. He similarly places the melody in the oboe here, bassoon as the bass instrument, and clarinet sandwiched in between. But unlike that Nausicaa trio, he adds a flute that occupies a similar register to oboe. And you'll notice that when I play this passage again, the melody is a bit harder to hear because all of the other parts are very active. Even still, it all fits together very nicely. Also, the point here isn't necessarily to hear this as a melody and accompaniment, but rather a complete texture with the woodwind timbre. Melodically, it's not really related to the theme that follows, so it's really just this isolated moment, and when you hear this while watching the film, it really fits perfectly. So this bit of introduction ends with a half cadence G chord, which leads directly into the first statement of the main theme, also in C minor. And the tempo slows down considerably from the start of the woodwind phrase. Here's the first 8 measures of the main theme. The first violins have the melody, and the rest of the strings fill out the harmony below, with occasional moving contrapuntal inner voices. But the texture is fairly simple for now. He wants to present this melody very clearly without any distractions or counter melodies. Once we've heard this basic theme 1 or 2 times, then he can start adding more middle ground melodies, but for now it's very straightforward. Notice the syncopation in the melody. Hisaishi could have written it this way instead, and the rhythms would have been more square, but probably more standard or common. But by moving these notes in 8th note earlier, the melody has a bit more momentum and doesn't feel as rigid. It's something that Hisaishi does a lot. He merges aspects of classical music and certain popular genres and creates his own distinct musical environment. In classical music theory terms, these first 8 measures can be labeled as the antecedent phrase of a 16-measure theme. It starts with a 2-measure basic idea, then Hisaishi repeats this idea but transposes it down. So it's the same idea but sequentially moved down to fit the chords. Then he takes a fragment of that basic idea, just 1 measure's worth, and repeats that several times, eventually leading into a cadence. This is a very standard approach to melodic form. You come up with a 2-measure motivic idea, then repeat it, maybe change the chords a bit, alter the pitches slightly even, but keep the basic shape intact. Then you take a fragment of that idea, sequence it several times through a progression of chords, and land on some type of cadence. In terms of harmony, it's very straightforward. He starts on the tonic C minor chord, then creates a descending stepwise bass line, alternating between root chords and inversion chords. So the sequenced melodic pattern is accompanied by a sequential harmonic pattern. He ends the phrase on a half cadence, meaning the 5 chord of C minor, so that naturally leads us into the consequent phrase. You can usually identify when something has an antecedent consequent phrase structure, when there's a half cadence midway through, or some cadence that doesn't feel final, and then the next part starts the same way the first half started. So that's what we get here. The melody starts exactly the same way. In fact, the first four measures are identical to the first four measures of the antecedent phrase, with the same exact harmony. Then it's the last four measures here that distinguish this phrase from the first one. The fragmentation is a bit different here. It almost feels like a contrasting idea that leads into a cadence, this time a full cadence to the tonic C minor chord. I always find that breaking a theme like this one down into individual components helps you realize just how simple it can be. Hisaishi isn't doing anything all that unique here formally. This type of form has been going strong for hundreds of years. In a classical piece, we might expect some type of transition or development section to follow, or maybe even a second theme. But instead, we get kind of a repeat of the antecedent phrase, but transposed to the relative major key of E flat major. Here's the basic idea. Notice that the rhythms aren't syncopated this time. There's a more heroic or regal quality to it because of the more rigid rhythms. The basic idea is repeated, then in a sort of similar way to the first antecedent phrase, we get some fragmentation of the basic idea, which leads into a cadence. Notice that the cadential part of this phrase is extended by a measure. That's because we get another instance of what I labeled the Hisaishi cadence earlier. The dominant harmony starts with a suspended fourth scale degree. This time, however, he does actually resolve the note down to the third. In terms of harmony, we've modulated to E flat major, but the progression is basically the same. What was minor 1 to minor 5-6 to major 6 to major 3 is exactly that, but the major minor is reversed. The next part is a little different. We actually have two chords in a measure here. That often happens during the ends of phrases. We get an acceleration of the harmonic pacing. Then, to get us back into C minor, he uses a pivot chord, this F minor 7 chord. It functions as either the minor 2 chord in E flat major or the minor 4 chord in C minor. Remember, the original antecedent phrase ended with a cadence using the minor 4 chord, so he's repeating that here and bringing us back to C minor. Except we don't immediately get C minor, we get the G sus chord, so this is another half cadence. But we're anticipating in the next measure that will be in C minor. So next we have what I'll call a contrasting theme. Although in the same key, C minor, it's not anything we've heard before, and it's not even melodically or harmonically related to the previous theme. Although many of the same chords are used and certain aspects of the melody are familiar, like the syncopation. In terms of the form, this also has a period structure with an antecedent and a consequent phrase. Instead of 16 measures total, this period is condensed down to 8 measures, which in many ways is the more common length. The antecedent phrase starts with a new 2-measure basic idea in the woodwinds, spanning 3 octaves with flutes, oboes, clarinets, and bassoons all present. Then we get a 2-measure contrasting idea that ends in a half cadence. By the way, this 7 chord here could also be labeled as a secondary dominant chord, specifically a 5 of 3, but there's a reason I'm leaving it as a 7 chord. You'll see in a moment. The dominant harmony leads us into the consequent phrase, which starts with the basic idea once again. Then the same contrasting idea, this time ending in a full cadence. And this B flat major chord, that 7 chord that I mentioned, moves directly back into the 1 chord. So it's really not a secondary dominant chord here at all. Instead, we get kind of a modal sounding cadence. I'll play the whole phrase again. By the way, I had a real hard time hearing some of these background parts, and the violin line in particular. I think each beat 4 had something like this, descending 16th notes, but I wasn't super confident about the actual pitches. Alright, so after that brief contrasting theme, or B section, whatever you want to call it, we get the return of the main theme, back in C minor. I won't show the formal analysis because it's basically the exact same thing as before. What's different is the instrumentation. The melody starts in the cello section with a much thinner background texture. In fact, the woodwind part that I notated is so soft, almost not even noticeable. Another bit of music that I wasn't 100% sure about the pitches, but they have something similar to this at least. When we get to the consequent phrase, that's where Hisaishi places the climactic moment of the cue. So there's a really dramatic ritardando and the full orchestra playing fortissimo. But other than the instrumentation and orchestration, formally the music is basically an exact repeat with just a few measures added on in the end, like an outro. Goes to show that you can take the same musical idea and use it in very different textures and densities. All right, so I hope this video was helpful in understanding musical form, specifically how Hisaishi uses very simple and common melodic formal structures to create a theme. In my very next video, I'll construct my own track using a similar form and drawing inspiration from Hisaishi. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you then.